Welcome to another video. This time I want to talk about the injustices carried out by those who control the world, which are the Edomites, the injustices they do in the form of law. And it was interesting to me that the US government, since the riots began during the pandemic and a lot before that, but especially after the pandemic, has made many government agencies teach environmental injustices specifically, but injustices in general against minorities that are Black, Latino. That if you watch my videos are the Israelites, and I was surprised. Of course there is a scripture that says, Psalm 64, that they themselves are going to expose each other, and here is a man who according to him is the founder of this movement called environmental justice. But what I see is that with all the awards that have been given to him, I think that he is this dude is part of the system, and he is possibly Mason or something like that. He is a sellout because at the same time he tells the truth about the injustices, but he also supports this lie about environmental change. The injustices are true and are based on a form of politics, forms of law, as Psalms 94 says, but this environmental change, as the pandemic did not work, this new so-called pandemic is going to be this change that is happening in the climate. It is the new pandemic, but you know, if you have seen videos, the world elite, the Edomites, they have the capacity to control the climate. There is no so-called change. You know, they are controlling and causing these heat waves, these floods. They are causing them. So when I see that this man supports this theory, then I realize that he is a sellout. And let's see what other government agencies have done to reveal themselves of how they make unjust laws against Israelites. A department that revealed to us that specifically the banking industry after the Great Depression made some explicitly racist laws, made some laws that in English are said to be redlining that the largest cities in the United States to recover from the Great Depression, they granted mortgages and marked places where only white people can live, and then they marked places that only indigenous Black, Latino people can live. They marked it as red. That is why they call it red line, and in those red areas is where they put the industries, all the pollution, all the traffic, liquor stores, everything that is apartments that are multi-family houses that ruin any neighborhood. D was the worst, and the red where they marked red were places for indigenous Black, Latinos, and their 2N, they were places to put factories and pollution. And all that were places. It is also where they put multi-family houses, apartments, small houses, very congested houses. And you may ask how you can do that? Well, with the loans, I know why I have asked for loans, and they ask you what race you are if you are Latino. They want to know if you are Latino, of Black or indigenous descent, to screw you, because anyone can call themselves Latino today, and they already know that if you are Chinese and according to you, because you live in Mexico, you want to call yourself Latino, does not count, and the banks know that and do not count you. They only screw you if you are of indigenous descent, of Black descent, and if you are of those descent, they do not approve loans in certain places. They do not give you loans in good places, so these practices continued under those tricks. That is why they ask you for that information. If you are of Black, Latin or indigenous descent, and Latin with indigenous blood, stop the antics, because there are many who may say they are Latinos when convenient. If you're of Black, indigenous descent, they don't give you loans in certain places, and that's how they can keep white people in one place and Latino people in another, because let's say now in many places, many things have changed, but in general it's the same. It's very difficult for a Latino or Black to get a good loan, good interest in certain places. The only way you can do it is to pay cash, so that's how they keep people in certain places with the mortgages and with loans, and they also do the same thing for business loans. If you have Black or indigenous descent, forget about a business loan with good interest, forget, they won't give you shit. But if you are of any other white, Chinese descent, from the Indian, Thai, whatever there is, they give interest almost zero. But if you are a Black of slave descent, because there are Blacks who they do hook up like the Ethiopians, because they know that the Ethiopians are not Israelites, then they do well by them. But if you are Black of Slave descent, or if you are of indigenous descent, forget it, then it is not necessarily a matter of color, it is a matter of whether you are an Israelite or not. Later, we are going to read all of Psalm 94, which is a prayer that asks God for revenge against our enemy. What CalEPA did is study these laws that they made after the Great Depression so that the white race will rise economically, and that blacks and Latinos stay down, specifically blacks, indigenous, and Latinos. Let's not play stupid, because there are also other races that came later, many people from India, many people from Asian countries, and they were not affected by these laws. It is not against the color of your skin, as they say. That is crap. It is not the color of your skin, they target it. It is against blacks of slave descent, against indigenous people, and against Latinos of indigenous blood. Let's not play stupid, and those happen to be the Israelites. Let us read now. Pollution and prejudice. Redlining, or marking in red, refers to the demarcation of certain districts of poor minority urban populations where government and private funding was excluded. This set of practices included racial and environmental factors as criteria for assessing the perceived wealth of neighborhoods, and led to many of the environmental disparities we see affecting communities of color across the state today. 1930s era digitized neighborhood assessment forms produced by the Inequality Mapping Project, a collaboration of scholars from Virginia Tech, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Maryland, and led by Robert K. E. Nelson and Brent Sebel of the University of Richmond. The New Economic Policy, Not for Everyone President. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Economic Policy was the government's response to the Great Depression, and his Homeowners Lending Act, HOLC, was intended to stabilize the nation's mortgage lending system. But not everyone had access to the benefits of the law, specifically government-backed mortgages with low interest rates and better terms. Between the 1930s and 1940s, the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, and the Veterans Administration provided low-cost, government-backed loans to millions of white Americans so they could purchase new homes in the suburbs, while denying people of color access to mortgages and home ownership opportunities. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government issued $120 billion in mortgage loans, 98% of which went to whites. How did this happen? To help reduce the risk of default on government-backed loans, neighborhoods in more than 200 cities in the United States, including 8 in California, were assessed using criteria first established by the government-sponsored HOLC. HOLC screening practices were later codified in FHA underwriting guidelines. The purpose of the assessment was to determine if a neighborhood was safe enough to take advantage of federal loans, and the resulting residential safety maps were color-coded. Neighborhoods that were considered high risk to lenders were outlined in red, and neighborhoods considered in decline were outlined in yellow. Best and desirable neighborhoods were outlined in green and blue, respectively. A credit rating hierarchy that systematically favored certain neighborhoods and populations while disadvantaged others, with long-lasting and far-reaching effects. This financial exclusion practice became known as redlining. The connection to the environment criteria for evaluations included housing quality, sales and rental values, and, in an act of explicit institutional racism, the resident's race, ethnicity, and class. In the HOLC assessment of the 1930s, black, indigenous, and other colored people were referred to as inharmonious racial or nationality groups. Less well known is how the presence of smoke, odors, and fog, or environmental factors, also drove the mortgage security risk score for a neighborhood, as federal investments were made in the form of mortgage loans in the best and most desirable Neighborhoods, local governments acted to protect that investment through zoning decisions. These decisions brought new industrial facilities to or near red-marked communities, while at the same time maintaining racial restrictions through local covenants. Government racism explicit to implicit. The HOLC's key function was to purchase existing mortgages that were at risk of foreclosure and then issue new mortgages to those same homeowners on more favorable terms. HOLC examiners consulted with local bank loan officers, municipal officials, appraisers, and real estate agents to assess real estate values and mortgage loan risks for entire neighborhoods in major cities across the United States. Their reports show that race was explicitly considered a key factor in the assessments, and that any significant racial or ethnic minority population automatically leads to a high-risk classification regardless of the condition of the neighborhood. While there is debate about how much direct influence these maps had on subsequent lending decisions, historian Richard Rothstein notes in his book, The Color of the Law: How Government Segregated America, 2017, that they are left the federal government recorded as judging African Americans simply because of their race to be low risks. Likewise, the FHA was created to support new owners in the purchase of a first home, acting as an insurer of new bank mortgages. To determine a borrower's eligibility for insurance under this program, FHA conducted property appraisals to determine property value and risk of default. The policy for carrying out these appraisals was formalized in the FHA Underwriting Manual. The 1936 version of the FHA Underwriting Manual explicitly classified the presence of racial and ethnic groups in the same category of adverse influence as environmental contaminants. For example, include a sentence that says, "Protection from adverse influences provided by these media generally includes prevention of infiltration by commercial and industrial uses, occupation by lower classes, and inharmonious racial groups." Such explicit racial language was discontinued in the 1947 and 1958 versions of the FHA subscription manual, but the tactic of keeping people of color and environmentally hazardous land uses out of white neighborhoods continued. Without directly mentioning race, it became implicit. For example, the category of adverse influences was renamed physical and social attractiveness. Similarly, another part of the manual directed appraisers to rate neighborhoods favorably where families were nice. One sentence says family-constituted neighborhoods that are pleasant, physical conditions are acceptable, generally exhibit strong attractiveness and stability. Reinforcing structural racism. Structural racism occurs when multiple institutions are involved in practices that benefit white people about people of color, regardless of intent. In the FHA manual, we see that local appraisers are instructed to consider whether wealthy, predominantly white neighborhoods had ways to prevent encroachment by blacks and other people of color and environmental hazards over time. Tactics recognized by the FHA manual to reinforce those structures included the use of natural and artificial barriers in ways that led to disparities in amenities such as green space in many of today's neighborhoods. For example, the manual enlisted local governments to promote the implementation of strong and enforceable zoning ordinances and protection covenants. For example, ultimately, HOLC and FHA policies that treated both environmental hazards and disharmonious racial groups as a risk to housing values promoted the development of both racially and environmentally segregated cities. And they continued to implicitly encourage those tendencies even after the removal of the explicitly racist language. Those federal programs also intersected with local policies in ways that reinforce trends towards segregated housing, as well as disproportionate pollution loads. Although explicitly race-based zoning ordinances were deemed unconstitutional in 1917, local officials in the United States used economic zoning ordinances for decades to prohibit anything except single-family residential development within predominantly white areas. Meanwhile, communities of color were frequently zoned to allow for multifamily, commercial, and industrial use, even when those uses did not yet exist. For example, Rothstein, 2017, notes that, in Los Angeles, a black community settled in the south-central area of the city in the 1940s. The neighborhood had some industry, but its non-residential character was more firmly entrenched. When the city began a local rezoning process for commercial or industrial facilities, and as a result, facilities like auto junkyards and manufacturing plants became commonplace there. These economic zoning ordinances that were actively encouraged by the federal government brought polluting land uses to communities of color, which also led to lower property values and higher perceived credit risk, and thus reduced economic and geographic mobility due to the presence of those same land uses. Rothstein, 2017, points out how these same factors simultaneously contributed to making those communities ads were not eligible for loans backed by HOLC and FHA. This created a reinforcing loop that kept pollution concentrated in communities of color and trapped residents in those neighborhoods by denying them the means to leave. When the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, developed insured foreclosed mortgages as a way to promote homeownership across the country, these zoning practices made African Americans ineligible for such mortgages because banks and FHAs considered the existence of nearby rooming houses, commercial developments, or industries to create risk to the value of the home. Ownership of single-family areas without such mortgages, the cash cost of African American homes was higher than that of similar homes in white neighborhoods, leaving homeowners with fewer resources for maintenance. African American homes were more likely to deteriorate, which reinforced conditions in the slums of their neighborhoods' rivers. In contrast, he notes that zoning attempted to protect white neighborhoods from blight by ensuring that few industrial or environmentally unsafe businesses could locate in them. Banned in this way, polluting industry had no choice but to locate near African American residencies. Tour California's Red Line cities. Explore the interactive map below to see how California's historically redlined areas illustrate current pollution and health burden. Some of the maps reflect the presence of roads and railways, land uses that were mentioned in the FHA manual as ways to reduce the encroachment of inharmonious uses. Click on the polygons to read the text of the historical HOLC forms. You will find more references to unhealthy land uses in the areas marked in red than in the green or blue areas. Consider how often terms such as industry, factories, railroads, odors, oil, sewers, traffic, and poor street conditions are used to describe areas marked in red, while words such as parks, golf courses, recreation, trees, and country clubs are prevalent in the areas segregated for white communities. For another story illustrating the environmental connection, check out the lines that shape our cities, connecting today's environmental inequalities to the politics of red-marked communities of the 1930s, a collaboration of the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond, the Science Museum of Virginia, and ESRI. When we look at CES scores across California and disregarding the HOLC designation, we see that race is closely associated with cumulative impacts, as represented By CES scores. The top 10% of least polluted neighborhoods are 72% white, while the top 10% of most polluted neighborhoods are 89% people of color. The racial and ethnic disparities in pollution load and vulnerability we see today are likely the result of many complex and interrelated causes, including many not described here. In our approach, we focus on marking the 1930s as a relatively quantifiable way to explore the connections between the HOLC designation and current environmental conditions, as measured by CES 3.0. Both HOLC designations and CES scores are assigned to specific geographic areas that can be plotted on a map. By overlaying the two maps, we can explore whether there are common geographic patterns between historical HOLC neighborhood ratings and current environmental, public health, and socio-economic conditions. In the figure below, the Stockton HOLC map is overlaid with the CES scores map, and the overlapping polygons are combined to generate a CES score for each neighborhood on the HOLC maps. Although it is difficult to definitively conclude that the red line caused current disparities, we can use some simple methods to characterize the relationship and assess the degree of association. We measured these relationships by assigning CES indicator scores to each HOLC assessed neighborhood and then analyzed trends in the relationship between HOLC grade and CES score across all HOLC assessed communities in California. We found, when we plot each neighborhood's CES score from the HOLC maps of 1930s California cities as an individual point, we can see how the neighborhood level CES scores are distributed by city and HOLC grade, indicated by the color of each point. From this graph, we can see that there is considerable variation in CES scores both within and between cities, and we can begin to see some trends in the relationship between HOLC grade and CES score. When we look at the neighborhood level average CES score by HOLC grade within each city, the relationship between HOLC grade and CES score becomes clearer. 4. The 8 California cities included in the HOLC assessments, the neighborhoods that were red flagged by the HOLC in the 1930s have the highest average CES scores today, meaning that, on average, they are most disadvantaged by pollution loads than neighborhoods that received any other rating. For 7 of those 8 cities, the trend in the average neighborhood level CES score by HOLC grade from least to most disadvantaged is ABCD, reflecting the HOLC rating scale of the 1930s. We also combined the neighborhoods assessed by the HOLCs from all 8 California cities to analyze the statewide relationship between HOLC grade and CES score. We found that across California, neighborhoods that were rated A on HOLC maps from the 1930s are much more likely to have relatively low levels of pollution load or population vulnerability today, while neighborhoods that were rated D in the 1930s are much more likely to have higher levels of pollution load or vulnerability. When we look in more detail at the 20 individual CES indicators that contribute to the overall CES scores shown in the graphs above, we find that the relationship between HOLC grade and neighborhood level scores are broadly consistent across all of those indicators. For 18 of the 20 CES indicators, neighborhoods that received a D or hazardous rating in the 1930s HOLC assessments had the highest average level of pollution load or population vulnerability, while neighborhoods that received an A or better grade had the lowest average level of pollution load or vulnerability. For 17 of the 20 indicators, the trend in average pollution load or population vulnerability from low to high by HOLC grade was ABCD. HOLC designation and segregation. We also investigated the current approximate demographic composition of the neighborhoods that were included in the 1930s HOLC maps to assess whether the patterns of segregation that were reflected in the HOLC surveys have persisted over time. The figure to the right shows the current population distribution of each racial ethnic group in the neighborhoods that were assessed by the HOLC in the 1930s. We can see that today's white population is still overrepresented compared to other groups in neighborhoods that received an A or B grade from the HOLC in the 1930s and underrepresented in neighborhoods that received A, C or D grade. On the other hand, today's Hispanic, Native American, and Black populations are underrepresented in neighborhoods that received an A or B grade from the HOLC in the 1930s and overrepresented in neighborhoods that received A, C grade, or D. While our focus focused only on the pollution load and population vulnerability indicators captured by California Enviro Screen, other indicators, such as those related to climate change vulnerability, are also important to examine in future studies. Other researchers have already begun to investigate the relationship between historical restraint policies and climate resilience. For example, Jeremy S. Hoffman's research is the subject of a map of history that illustrates the relationship between historical red flag policies and the occurrence of the urban heat island effect today. Highlights: we found that less favorable historical HOLC risk ratings are generally associated with worse environmental conditions and higher population vulnerability to the effects of pollution today. And we found that people of color are overrepresented in these neighborhoods. Although the association between historical policies and current conditions does not prove that HOLC's redlining policy has directly or exclusively caused the current disparities in pollution load, the general trend is clear. Combining HOLC maps from the 1930s with contemporary data on demographics, socioeconomic and environmental conditions shows how systemic and entrenched racism in government actions likely contributed to the segregated neighborhoods and environmental injustices we see today. To finish, we are going to read this Psalm 94. I had planned to also cover more maps with my own free mapping tool. It is called QGIS. You can download the polygons from the pages and you can play with the maps and see how the pollution in any part of California is more concentrated where the Israelites, the Latinos, and the blacks and the indigenous people live, and also these areas where they are marked in red until today in many cities that have not changed much. Until today, minorities continue to live in the red area. I was going to play with that, but well, I think you already understood after after reading that long study, I think you got the hang of it. Let's read Psalm 90. For God of vengeance. Show yourself, magnify yourself, O judge of the earth, give payment to the proud. Who are the Edomites? How long will the wicked, how long, O Yahweh, will the wicked rejoice? How long will they speak harsh things, and all who do iniquity boast? They break your people, O Yahweh, and afflict your inheritance. What are they doing with these laws? And I heard, someone who said that they are not responsible for what their ancestors did, that this did not even happen long ago. This was in the 30s, but the practices continued until today. Someone had the nerve to say that they are not responsible because of what their ancestors do when they continue to do them is hypocrisy. Is what that person said, but well, he says to your people, O Yahweh, they break, and they afflict your inheritance. The widow and the foreigner they kill, and the orphans they take their lives. Many of those things continue to happen today, and rather they happen to extreme levels during the slavery and the conquest, but the injustices with the police and all that still continue. And they said, he will not see Yahweh, nor will he understand the God of Jacob. What other? Israelites, us black Latinos and Indians? Understand, fools of the people, and you fools. When will you be wise? The one who made the ear will not hear. What do you think that the one who created the ear does not hear, does not see? The one who formed the eye will not see? He who punishes the nations, will he not rebuke? He is talking to the Edomites who think that they will not be punished for the stupid things they do. Doesn't the one who teaches science to man know? Yahweh knows the thoughts of men, which are vanity. Blessed is the man who knew Yahweh. Correct, and in your law instruct him, to make him rest in the days of affliction, that. This coincides with the scripture that says that wisdom and understanding will be your strength. In the last days, as long as for the impious one digs the hole, and he is talking about. There is a scripture, I do not remember which one, that says, whoever makes a trap in that same trap is going to fall, is what it refers to. While for the impious one digs, they think they are making a big trap, planning the extermination of the Israelites, but for him it is the hole, for him it is the trap, because Yahweh will not abandon his people nor forsake his inheritance, but the judgment will be returned to justice, and in after her shall all the upright in heart go. Who will rise up for me against the evil ones? Who will be for me against those who do iniquity? If Yahweh did not help me, soon my soul would dwell in silence. Exactly, if our Creator doesn't help us, no one is going to help us, because those other races hate us. When I said, my foot slips, your mercy, oh, Yahweh, sustained me. In the multitude of my thoughts within me, your consolations gladdened my soul. Will the throne of iniquities be joined with you that does wrong under the form of law? They are asking, do you think that the Edomites are going to do something in your favor when they wrong them in the form of a law like these racist laws, like the loans that they did not give to Latinos and blacks? Of course, they did not get together against the life of the just, and they condemn innocent blood. But Yahweh has been my refuge, and my God the rock of my confidence. And he will bring their iniquity back upon them, and destroy them in their own wickedness, Yahweh. Our God will destroy them.